The Daleks are the most iconic villains in all of British television, and they started as mutant blobs in metal trash cans that couldn't leave their own basement. So today, I'm breaking down every single Dalek model and what makes each one terrifying, starting with the ones that couldn't even use stairs. Mark 1 Dalek. Here's the thing about the very first Daleks. They weren't robots. Everyone assumes they were robots, but they were actually mutated organic creatures, survivors of a devastating genetic war on the planet Skaro, entombed inside metal casings that functioned as life support, wheelchair, and weapon system all in one. They first showed up in December 1963 and single-handedly transformed a children's educational program into a national phenomenon. Kids were hiding behind sofas across Britain because of what was essentially a pepper pot with a plunger arm and a single gun. But here's where it gets funny. These things were completely dependent on static electricity channeled through grooved metal floors in their bunker. The moment they rolled off those floors, they were done. The most terrifying new villain in science fiction literally couldn't cross its own doorstep, and yet the psychological impact on audiences was so massive that it redefined the entire show's identity overnight. A pepper pot that can't climb stairs became the single most feared creature in British pop culture. I don't know what to tell you, but if the Mark 1 was limited by its own engineering, wait until you meet the Dalek that decided it was everybody's boss. Dalek Supreme. So the Daleks, a species whose entire identity revolves around being identical screaming tanks with zero individuality, invented middle management almost immediately. Let that sink in for a second. The Dalek Supreme first showed up in the Daleks Master Plan back in 1965, and its whole deal was simple. It had a black dome and skirt instead of the standard gray, and it got to boss the others around. That's it. That's the promotion. A different paint job. Basically the Dalek equivalent of a corner office and a reserved parking spot. But here's the thing, the Supreme wasn't just a louder Dalek, it had genuine authority over strategy, resource allocation, and long-term planning. It was an actual commanding officer making real decisions while every other Dalek in the room had to shut up and comply. For a species that won't stop screaming about purity and unity, they built a hierarchy with politics and individual distinction almost immediately, which is, not ideal for the brand, and nobody can agree on what the Supreme actually is. Is it a specially bred caste with enhanced cognitive architecture, or is it just a rank any Dalek could climb to? Because the answer completely changes what Dalek society is. Multiple Daleks have held the title across different eras, and whether those are the same creature hopping through time or entirely different Daleks inheriting a fancy color scheme is still an open question. But if one Dalek with a black paint job bothers you, wait until the entire species splits into warring political factions. Imperial Daleks. The Imperial Daleks won. That's the part everyone forgets. In the Great Dalek Civil War depicted in remembrance of the Daleks, the Imperials didn't just edge out a victory, they crushed the renegade faction and proved definitively that their way of doing things worked. And their way was simple. One leader, total obedience, zero debate. The Emperor Dalek didn't rule through consensus or tradition. He ruled because he was smarter, more ruthless, and more strategically capable than every other Dalek in existence. His authority wasn't inherited, it was demonstrated every single day. And the Imperial forces organized themselves around that principle with terrifying efficiency, fielding standard units, special weapons Daleks, and elite squads and coordinated combined arms operations that made the Renegades look like amateurs with plungers. Here's the thing, they proved their ideology correct. Centralized authority under a singular genius beat every alternative Dalek philosophy thrown against it. Loyalty to one supreme individual turned out to be the strongest organizing principle their species ever produced. And then the Time War happened. The same rigid top-down command structure that made them unstoppable against other Daleks marched them straight into near extinction against the Time Lords. They won the argument and lost the war, which is, not ideal, but if you think the Imperials' military doctrine was intense, wait until you meet the single unit they built specifically to end arguments permanently. Special weapons Dalek. Every Dalek already has a death ray. That's the factory setting. So the fact that someone in Dalek R&D looked at the standard model and said, yes, but what if we made it more of a gun, is genuinely one of the funniest design decisions in science fiction history. The special weapons Dalek showed up in remembrance of the Daleks in 1988, and it threw out the entire playbook. No gun stock, no manipulator arm, just one massive weapon system bolted onto a bulkier casing. The thing was basically a turret that could move. slowly. But here's the thing, it didn't need to be fast. The weapon it carried could level buildings. Destructive output so far beyond standard Dalek armament that one shot simply deleted whatever was standing in front of it. The enlarged casing housed whatever nightmarish power generation systems were needed to fire that weapon, which meant mobility was sacrificed at the altar of raw annihilation, and the Daleks only deployed it during their civil war, when conventional forces hit a stalemate. This was their tactical nuke, their break glass in case of emergency option, which means even the Daleks looked at this thing and thought, yeah, let's maybe not use this unless we absolutely have to. The wildest part, they seemingly abandoned the concept afterward, built the ultimate weapon platform, proved it worked, then just shelved it. I don't know what to tell you, but speaking of that civil war, the faction that actually fielded these monsters is worth examining on its own: Renegade Daleks. Here's the thing about the Dalek Civil War. Both sides had the same guns, the same casings, the same extermination protocols. The Renegade Daleks weren't some knockoff faction running around with discount weaponry. They were fully operational, tactically sophisticated, and every bit as dangerous as the Imperials. The only difference was politics, and that's the part nobody wants to talk about. The Renegades were loyal to the Supreme Dalek rather than the Emperor, and for that crime, the Imperial faction slapped them with the label Renegade, which is, just propaganda. It's the Dalek equivalent of calling the other party traitors because they disagree with your management style. A species that literally screams about purity and unity every chance it gets managed to tear itself in half over what amounts to a leadership dispute. But here's where it gets interesting. The Renegades weren't just holding their own against a faction that had every advantage. The Imperials rolled out a special weapons Dalek, basically a mobile cannon designed to obliterate everything in its path, and the Renegades still kept fighting. They used deception, infiltration, and temporal exploitation. These weren't desperate rebels throwing rocks at tanks. They were a fully organized military force running sophisticated operations against an enemy that was functionally identical to them and better armed. The Renegades lost. History got written by the winners, and the winners called them traitors. But their existence proves something the Daleks would never willingly admit. They're capable of genuine ideological fracture. A civilization built entirely on conformity still couldn't stop itself from splitting apart the moment two leaders disagreed. But if internal politics nearly destroyed them, wait until you hear what an actual war across all of time and space did. Time War Daleks. Here's where the Daleks stop being a sci-fi army and become something closer to a god-level extinction event. The Time War wasn't a conflict that lasted years. It lasted centuries. Centuries of temporal warfare between the Daleks and the Time Lords, fought across every dimension, every timeline, and every conceivable plane of reality simultaneously. And the Daleks rose to meet it. Every single one of them, the entire species reorganized around one objective: win or cease to exist. They developed temporal manipulation, higher dimensional combat strategies, and weapons so abstract they didn't even operate within conventional physics anymore. We're not talking about upgraded laser guns. We're talking about weaponry that attacked the concept of existence itself, which is, not ideal for anyone standing nearby. But here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you about every Dalek story that came before this. The Time War Daleks proved that earlier design limitations weren't technological ceilings, they were choices. The Daleks could have developed temporal weapons at any point. They could have always been this powerful. They just didn't need to be. Every previous encounter where the Doctor barely scraped by, the Daleks were essentially fighting with one arm behind their back. And the darkest part? This was their peak. Maximum sophistication, maximum power, godlike capability across infinite timelines. And it nearly wiped every last one of them from existence. Turns out, becoming the most dangerous thing in the universe just means the universe tries harder to kill you. But the few that survived, they came back looking a little different. A lot more bronze drones. This is the Dalek. Not the first one, not the weirdest one, not the most powerful one, but this is the one you picture when someone says the word. The bronze drone showed up in the 2005 revival and basically never left, becoming the default Dalek for an entire generation of viewers. And honestly, there's a really good reason for that. Here's the thing, the Daleks had just survived the Time War, a conflict so insane it involved reality-bending weapons, temporal paradoxes, and battles fought across dimensions that shouldn't even exist. They had access to technology that could unwrite history, and when they needed to rebuild, they looked at all of that bleeding-edge nightmare tech and said, yeah, no, give us something that works. The bronze drone was the answer. Modular systems, tactical flexibility, easy to mass produce. Zero frills. It's the engineering equivalent of a civilization collectively deciding that a reliable pickup truck beats a concept car when you actually need to get things done. A species that nearly went extinct, choosing good enough over theoretically perfect, is weirdly respectable for a bunch of genocidal mutants in metal shells. The design philosophy was simple: prioritize production volume, prioritize field reliability, make every unit adaptable enough to handle whatever planet, whatever atmosphere, whatever enemy shows up. And it worked. The bronze configuration stuck around for centuries of post-time war operations, which tells you everything. Dalek engineers are not sentimental. If a better option existed, they'd have built it. The fact that they didn't means this was the sweet spot between capability and practicality. But if you think the Daleks were content to just keep stamping out bronze drones forever, you clearly don't know the Daleks, because their next redesign threw out everything. New paradigm Daleks. In 2010, the Daleks did something genuinely unprecedented. They looked at their own design, a design that had been iconic for nearly 50 years, and said, no, scrap it, we're starting over. And honestly, you have to respect the ambition even if the execution made half the fan base lose their minds. Here's the thing, the new paradigm Daleks weren't just a cosmetic update. They were a complete species reboot. The in-universe logic is actually fascinating. These Daleks were created from a progenitor device containing pure Dalek DNA, meaning they considered every Dalek that came before them to be impure, contaminated, not real Daleks. So they built themselves from scratch, untethered from every design constraint that had shaped the species since 1963. The result was dramatically larger casings with a completely different silhouette, and a color-coded system that assigned specialized roles to each unit. Red for drones, blue for strategists, orange for scientists, yellow for the Eternal, and white for the Supreme. It was basically Dalek middle management with a fresh coat of paint. But here's where it gets complicated. Fans hated them, not all fans, but enough. The enlarged proportions, the bright candy colors, the hunchback silhouette. Long-term viewers looked at these things and saw Power Rangers villains, not the terrifying war machines they'd grown up with. The backlash was loud enough that something interesting happened. New paradigm Daleks quietly started disappearing from subsequent seasons. Their appearances dropped off dramatically, and the bronze Daleks crept back into frame like nothing ever happened. It's a genuinely rare case of fan reception, directly altering the trajectory of an iconic design. The Daleks tried to evolve past their own legacy, and the audience dragged them back. But if you think a redesign controversy is wild, wait until you hear about the Dalek that showed up on Earth completely alone, with zero backup and zero casing. Reconnaissance Dalek. Every Dalek model we've talked about so far has one thing in common. They operate as part of a fleet, a hierarchy, a collective. They have backup. The Reconnaissance Dalek had none of that, and it was still one of the most terrifying things to ever crawl out of a Doctor Who episode. This thing crash-landed on Earth completely alone. No fleet in orbit, no Emperor barking orders, no support infrastructure of any kind. Just one Dalek stranded in hostile territory, figuring it out. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Rather than building itself a new casing and rolling around screaming "exterminate" like a normal Dalek would, this one took a different approach. It wore people. The Reconnaissance Dalek could pilot organic hosts, merging its consciousness with a living body to create a biological mechanical hybrid. A Dalek wearing a human like a suit, which is, not ideal for the human involved. This wasn't just physical control either. It was full integration, Dalek intelligence operating through biological hardware, adapting in real time, walking among people completely undetected. But the scariest part wasn't the body snatching, it was the brain. This Dalek could think independently, it could strategize, it could negotiate. Let that sink in for a second. A Dalek that doesn't immediately try to kill you is somehow way more frightening than one that does, because it means it's planning something worse. It eventually evolved into a full Dalek-human hybrid form, which raises a question nobody in the show really wanted to answer. If a Dalek's consciousness can exist inside a biological body, what even makes a Dalek anymore? Is it the casing, the DNA, the hatred? Because this thing proved you don't need the metal shell to be absolutely horrifying. But if a single rogue unit operating alone gives you chills, wait until you see what the Daleks built when they went full firing squad. Executioner Daleks. Here's the thing about the Daleks. They're already a species whose entire identity revolves around killing. Every single one of them is a purpose-built murder machine encased in weaponized armor. So when the Daleks themselves look at their own ranks and decide that some of them need to be better at killing, you know something has gone sideways. The Executioner Daleks showed up in the 2022 specials, and they immediately stood out. Heavier armor, more imposing silhouettes, and a general vibe that says, I'm not here to occupy your planet, I'm here to end something specific, because that's exactly what they are. These aren't patrol units, they aren't garrison forces, they're deployed to critical military operations where the objective isn't conquest, it's termination, and the name does all the heavy lifting. They didn't call them warrior Daleks, they didn't call them soldier Daleks, they called them executioners. That's not a combat designation, that's a sentencing designation. These things aren't fighting battles, they're carrying out verdicts. What's fascinating is that this isn't even a new idea for the Daleks. The Special Weapons Dalek did essentially the same thing back in 1988, just traded versatility for raw destructive output. The Executioners are the spiritual successors to that philosophy. Decades later, and the Daleks keep arriving at the same conclusion. Sometimes you need a bigger, meaner Dalek for the job, which is, you know, not ideal for everyone else in the universe. The fact that they formalize this into a distinct military designation suggests genuine doctrinal evolution. Not just, here's a stronger Dalek, but an entire combat role with its own deployment criteria and operational purpose. Even a species that considers itself perfect apparently believes in specialist murder, but if you think a Dalek built for killing is unsettling, wait until you see what happens to one that's already been killed. Destroyed Dalek. Here's where things get genuinely strange. Not strange in a the Daleks did something evil way, because that's just Tuesday. Strange in this contradicts everything we know about how Daleks think way. The destroyed Dalek is exactly what it sounds like. A Dalek that's been wrecked, broken, rendered non-functional. But here's the thing, it's not scrap, it's not recycled, it's kept, preserved, possibly even displayed, and that makes zero sense. This is a species that exterminates anything it considers imperfect. Weakness is literally the worst thing a Dalek can be. They've killed their own kind for showing hesitation, for developing empathy, for being the wrong color, so why would they keep a destroyed version of themselves around? That's like a bodybuilder framing a photo of themselves on a hospital bed. The canonical information here is thin. Let me be upfront about that. We don't have a full backstory explaining the destroyed Dalek's purpose. What we have is a concept that raises more questions than it answers. Maybe it's a trophy, a monument to a Dalek that fell in battle, preserved out of something resembling reverence. If that's the case, the Daleks have a concept of honoring their dead. That's enormous. That's practically sentimental. Maybe it's a warning, a broken Dalek left on display to remind enemies what happens when you fight them. Or maybe it's something darker, a Dalek deliberately disabled and kept alive inside a shattered casing as punishment, which is, you know, not ideal. Whatever the answer is, the destroyed Dalek forces you to admit that Dalek society has layers nobody wants to talk about. A species obsessed with perfection, choosing to preserve imperfection is either deeply reverent or deeply cruel. Possibly both, but if one mysterious Dalek variant has you scratching your head, wait until you see what happened when the Daleks tried to reinvent themselves from the ground up. Paradigm 2. This is the newest Dalek to exist, and I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot to work with here. Paradigm 2 is associated with the most recent Doctor Who content, dropping around April 2026, and detailed specifications are about as available as a polite Dalek, which is to say, they aren't. What we do know is this: the name itself tells a story. Paradigm 2 suggests a formal successor to the new Paradigm Daleks introduced back in 2010, those colorful, oversized redesigns that split the fan base clean down the middle. Whether Paradigm 2 refines that controversial direction or throws it in the bin entirely is still an open question. And honestly, that uncertainty is part of what makes this interesting, because here's the thing, we've now covered 12 distinct Dalek models, 12, spanning from static charged pepper pots that couldn't leave their own floor to reality warping fleets that nearly consumed all of time and space. And after all of that, after 6 decades of continuous redesign, the Daleks are still iterating, still tweaking. Still not done. Think about that for a second. This is a species whose entire identity is built on the claim that they are the supreme beings in the universe. Perfect, unimprovable, the final word in biological and mechanical evolution, and yet they have spent over 60 years quietly admitting through every single redesign that the last version wasn't good enough. Every new model is a confession. Every upgrade is an acknowledgement that perfection hasn't been reached. 60 years of screaming exterminate and they still can't settle on a casing. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe perfection is just a work in progress. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.